Welcome. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar hosted by the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. My name is Victor Trinidad with NCPMI. This webinar is part of the Implementation and Scale Up webinar series. Today's topic is PBS and the Pyramid Model, Same Science, Different Contexts, presented by Lise Fox and Heather George. Thank you very much, and please proceed.
Thank you, Victor. I'm so glad to have my colleague Heather George here with me today to talk about what we believe is a super important topic. And what we're going to do in the webinar is talk about how the PBIS and the pyramid are aligned. We're going to spend a little time addressing misperceptions or challenges, why early educators may or may not think that PBIS and the pyramid are aligned and how we think about that. And then give you some tips if you're a district leader or a state leader about how we can move towards greater alignment and why. We're going to save time at the end for your questions, so please type them in. We'll remind you again, but we're hoping to have some back and forth with you as much as we can on a webinar. So we've always believed, so Heather's on the leadership team of PBIS, and most of you know me. I'm the PI on the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations and have been doing pyramid work for 25 years. And we've always believed these two things are related and aligned, and you'll see evidence that on our website where we talk about the alignment of pyramid model and PBIS. And if you go to the PBIS website, you'll also see that the pyramid model is called out as the way that we do implementation in early childhood settings and programs. But we know that's not always the reality. And that's why we wanted to have this call, because we think this is particularly important. So I'm going to flip it to Heather to just walk us through PBIS and kind of the essential structure and what the science of it is. And then I'll follow up with pyramid and how that fits.
Thanks, Lisa. So what you guys are going to see is that PBIS is so similar to pyramid because we are absolutely interconnected and interrelated. So PBIS is that multi-tiered system of support. It's that framework for organizing these evidence-based practices. And so as you guys are used to, when we talk about tier one, we're talking about universal interventions for everybody, meaning not just all for the students, but for the families and the adults that are working in that setting. There are some folks, we would look at tier two, targeted based approaches that need a little bit more support to be successful in that school setting or within that classroom. And then few at that tier three, needing the most intensive supports of instruction to be successful. But it's widely it's widely implemented, it's evidence-based, and it's supporting the students' social, emotional, behavioral, and academic success. You could go to the next one, please. So let's talk about the framework for all PBIS essential elements. And you're going to see there's some words that I wanted to have it pop out for you guys around that. We hear a lot about data systems and practices. And so I want you to know that the framework actually organizes all these evidence-based practices. And we're talking about because it needs to support all students. It's not just for a group of students or students that are, sometimes people think that are just choosing to act well and behave and everything. It's to support everybody on that campus and set up the system so that the adults can be successful in being able to implement with high fidelity, and then use the data to support decision making. So we want to know, what is working and what's not working so that we can adjust those practices and adjust the system so our adults can be most successful in that process. And we're going to use that data for ongoing continuous improvement from that decision making to ensure that everybody is achieving valued and equitable outcomes. So we've got great research over 30 years of PBIS being evidence-based. We've got these summary brief around as an evidence-based practice. If you were to click on these links, you can go straight to what's keeping up with the research from folks from across the country of the evidence-based and the randomized control trials. But we have found that overall, that when you implement PBIS with fidelity, that improves student engagement, improves the achievement, attendance, emotional regulation, and the overall school climate. We've also seen the studies that, again, implementing with fidelity, that it's decreasing disruptive behavior, as well as bullying behaviors, peer exclusion, racial inequities, and substance misuse, as well as decreases educator stress and burnout, which I think is awesome, that it's not just something that we're doing to kids, it's something that we're doing in the environment to support everybody within that community. And it's overall has shown that when implemented with fidelity, that improves student and adult mental health and well-being. So in fact, so many folks have come on board. We've been funded since 1998. And as of right now, we've got over 27,000 schools that are reporting into our national database. I do believe this is a conservative number because these are only the numbers of folks that are actually reporting and saying that they're actively implementing. It does not mean that all 27,000 schools are implementing with fidelity, because they're all in a different range of their implementation, all have different range of their challenges that they're dealing with. But it does mean that there are at least 27,000 schools, in fact, 27,921 that are saying that they are actively using PBIS. So what does this look like overall for implementation cascades? So we support states in engaging in PBIS, but let's go to the very far end of the individual student, because inevitably everything that we do, we want to make sure that we're having an impact on that individual student. And so in order to have that impact on that individual student, it means we need to set up a classroom overall so that there are effective practices within that classroom, that it's a safe environment for that classroom, and that that classroom is supporting the individual student and all the other students within that classroom. In order for that to happen, ideally, we've got to have the overall school and that school-wide approach supporting all of the classrooms within their environment. And what works most effectively too is if the district then is aware what the school is engaging in for this systems change work, and is able to support through the professional development, through the evaluation processes, through the funding streams that they're providing for their schools, to continue to provide the supports needed at that school site. And then the state, obviously, states are trickling down money to districts. And so what's important is that the state's aware what's happening out there, and that they're able to support all of their LEAs across their state, or the LEAs that are engaging in these preventative and proactive practices. What's important about this implementation cascade, and you can learn more about it in our PBIS implementation blueprint, is that it's children, family, and caregivers that are the base of all of this. So regardless of where they're coming into the system, whether they're going and contacting the district and talking with a personnel at the district office to enroll their child, they're going to the school to enroll the child that they're working with, they're meeting with the teacher within the classroom, or they're working with their individual child at home to support them on what the school is working on for positive behaviors at the school environment and helping them learn new skills. It's important to know that all of these are connected. So it's not just an isolated context per se, but that what happens at the school can absolutely inform what the district is doing to support that school and continue to support more schools. What happens at that school can actually positively impact what's happening then in the classroom. And so the big takeaway from this is that we are all connected. All of these contexts are connected here, are absolutely important, and we're all moving through this implementation. And there's not an ideal in where to start. The key is we just need to get started.
That is so impressive. So, when we started doing pyramid work, we were really inspired by PBIS and what PBIS had accomplished. And Heather, when I hear you speak about the number of schools, the really thoughtful structure of using implementation science for implementation and that connection, I think about 27,000 schools. I don't know how many of those are elementary schools, but there's a set of those that are elementary schools that include public pre-K. And that's like a really smart place to start this alignment, and a really important place. And if the pre-K is not on board, that's problematic with this school-wide effort. And I think part of that is our motivation to have this discussion. So in many ways, what we are doing is PBIS. It is PBIS. It is definitely the science that undergirds PBIS. It's the same science that we're using in the pyramid model. It's just a different context, right? So it's different because our kids are little. It's different because if you're sending your 3-year-old off to a program, the level of family engagement is much higher, right? There's a lot of communication with families when we're thinking about children who are not fully toilet trained and children who have naps and children who have, a different level of nurturance that is needed. It's going to look different in early intervention, which is one of our contexts. We start very early. The way we teach, of course, looks different. Our classrooms look different. The strategies we're going to use for reinforcement are going to be different because we're talking about very young children. And we also expect that children in our preschool and down classrooms are going to be children who have meltdowns. So we know that they're going to have meltdowns, and then as a consequence, social, emotional, and behavioral skills really is a foci of the work, right? Because if you don't have that in place, all the other learning can't happen. And so it's very much the same science, but our context is different. And everyone on the call who comes to PMI events kind of knows what the pyramid is. So we are tiered. Again, our inspiration very much comes from PBIS, as well as the public health model of what do we do for all, what do we need to be able to be ready to do for some that need a little bit more, and how are we poised and ready to support those very few children who might enroll in a program with persistent challenging behavior. And so the same logic is there. What might be a little different is that there's a lot of consistency and consensus in early childhood about what the practices are. And so we've defined those practices for each of the contexts in which you might be implementing the pyramid model. So again, we have a multi-tiered, just like PBIS, and the same kind of approach and framework. So when Heather said practices, systems, data, and outcomes, we have our practices. We call them the pyramid model practices. We seek to have the systems, right, where there's a tiered continuum of support. So every program knows kind of what are universals, what should we be doing for kids who need more, and what do we do for kids with persistent challenging behavior, and how do we get those practices to them? How do we coach our practitioners? How do we use data for decision making? In pyramid model, of course, we have our data tools, and we share the same focus on those equitable outcomes for all children, social, emotional, and behavioral skills. So we've defined it, as I said, really clearly and discreetly, and we have tools that measure the delivery of practices. And in pyramid model, we have that defined way that we approach professional development that includes practice-based coaching to make sure that we can get towards high fidelity. And then one of the elements that PBIS uses that really inspired us to think about what could be a data system that really would help people be able to understand when behavior happens and analyze the factors that surround those behaviors so that we could do better by children and by our teachers. We developed the behavior incident report system, and we're super excited that PBIS offers that as well in PBIS apps as the early childhood Swiss. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, that allows you to note when a child has an incident that exceeds what is developmentally expected, because we expect meltdowns. But when we have incidents that are more intense or longer duration or of higher intensity and raise big concerns, people do the behavior incident report, and then those data are summarized so that teams can make smart decisions about how do I support that teacher or child better, or how do we make changes in the environment to prevent behavior from occurring. We've defined, so as PBIS does, we have a very defined what's our approach for children who need a little bit more. We call that our tier 2. And we have a resource, if y'all haven't seen it, it came out this year, a new resource around tier 2. And then we also use very much a similar approach to PBIS around children who present with persistent challenging behavior. That includes a functional assessment, team-based process to develop a behavior support plan. So in many ways, I think we are so incredibly similar that it's kind of surprising to me when people aren't aligned and on the same page. I think what's different for us, of course, is that our kids are in these mixed delivery systems. So we might be in schools, and I'm a little envious of, you can say district, school, classroom, and we're all over the community, right? So we're in homes, we're in childcare, we're in schools, we're in Head Start programs. And so because of that mixed delivery system, it may be a little different how we get started, but we always start with leadership teaming. Just like in the implementation blueprint in PBIS, you have a team, right? You have a team at a district level, you have a team at a school level. And when we're starting brand new in Head Start or childcare or early intervention agencies or programs, we establish a team. When we're at a school, and if they're doing PBIS, we should be coming and being a part of that team, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense in something that's called school-wide that we would want to carve out something differently. And I think it's really important to the alignment that we become one team. So Heather, why don't you talk a little bit more about why we think alignment is so important?
Yeah, so I think, we're talking about the same kiddos overall. We're talking about the same families, and they're obviously much smaller, and then they get bigger. So let's work smarter and let's work together in this process, because this is our community. So having this shared message on the science of what works, I think, is absolutely critical. So, folks are saying, oh no, this only works in this setting. That's not accurate. Fact is that PBIS, the pyramid model, is PBIS. We call it PBIS because we were funded K through 12, and pyramid model was like, yeah, but what about the little kiddos in this process? And so remember, like, how that science actually started, and we were engaged in those conversations, like Lisa said, from the beginning when they were developing the pyramid model. So I think having that shared message that everything that we are learning, we're learning it together, and but the key is, can we help folks in understanding out there in the field and when they're implementing, to know that this is a continuation. It's the same thing is true, like, just because they go from middle school to high school, there's going to be another transition, and we need to make sure that there's some continuity between those two settings. So engaging in partnerships, increasing that visibility, that political investment. I think it's really important. People may go to, one of our events that we have that we sponsor through our center, or you may go to something that the pyramid model, sponsors, and people get excited. They're like, let's do this. But it's so important too. Yes, let's do this. And let's get everybody else connected in this, because we're talking about, at least 2 or 3 years old, or maybe even birth to grade 12 at this process that this school system is responsible for. And let's invest early in this process, and let's invest in sustainability to ensure that what we put into place in early intervention in our early childhood supports will sustain over time. Let's continue to as those kids are getting bigger, to be successful as they're growing. So how we're doing that is strengthening the local, state, and national initiatives to eliminate the use of exclusionary practices. We want to keep kids in school. We want to keep families within our community. We need to be able to learn how to meet the needs and to be proactive about meeting the needs of this wide range of challenges that are occurring with our kids and our families. But we've got to work together in this process so that we're consistent. So these shared messages for family engagement, the children are transitioning, like I said before, just because they're little and they're in a different environment separate from the elementary school doesn't mean that they get treated differently. Like, let's welcome them in early. Let's have them as part of this process. Let's have some of the older kids come to the the settings and the preschool settings to actually serve as mentors and read to the kids, and because they're going to be big kids too someday, and it would be great modeling. But building on partnerships that lead to community-wide investment, again, it's that thinking smarter mentality. They may not know exactly how it should look, but the key is that we are engaging in the same exact science. We're working with the same exact kids, essentially, because they will grow up. So we should be working together because this is good overall for environment. If we're creating these safe environments for kids when they're little, and we're continuing that as they get older, and they're learning to be respectful and problem solvers and being responsible and being able to, raise their hands when they're having issues, and parents are feeling safe to be able to come and talk to the teachers about concerns they have, and teachers are feeling safe being able to reach out to the parents and caregivers and to reach out to their fellow teachers for support when they need it. That truly is an overall investment for the community. And using and promoting the prevention practices that enhance those academic outcomes, engaging, this is a win-win for anybody, honestly. And I have to tell you, Lisa, when I look at the slide, again, that we developed, I don't think this is specific just to pre-K through 12, for example. I think there's so much of this that works anywhere else in other sectors. And so that's all I had to say about that.
I agree with you. And, the academic outcomes, I'm so grateful for the PBIS research, right, that we can anchor our work to. We have just 2 randomized trials around changes in social emotional behavior for kids. But you and all of the research that has happened around PBIS, you guys are a little older in the game than we are. And that we can point to those academic outcomes as well as the social emotional behavioral outcomes is just, I think, gives a lot of power to our ability to convince people that it's worth this investment of time to do this work. So Heather and I thought we'd have a little bit of a conversation about so that you can hear our enthusiasm for alignment and how important we think it is. But we know that there are misperceptions out there about what is PBIS. And I'm going to pose the questions from an early childhood lens, because most of our folks here are deeply in early childhood, of what some of those misperceptions are that I've heard, and have a conversation about them. And you'll have a chance at the end if you want to pose any more of those. I think I've captured the biggies. So I'm going to stop sharing and we'll just talk about it. So Heather's going to be a little bit in the hot seat for your PBIS Center about what I hear people talking about. So one of the strong misperceptions is that, all right, well, PBIS is this behavioral approach, and it really doesn't pay much attention to social emotional development, family engagement, or responsive practices. So is that really true, Heather?
The quick answer is no, that's not true. If we actually have a guide that we've developed on supporting and responding to classroom practices. So I think that it's funny when I hear that, because when I think of social emotional behavior, the social part's how kids and adults are interacting with each other. The emotional part's how they feel. And the behavioral part is essentially how they're acting. And that's everything PBIS, when we talk about practices that we're trying to teach folks, that the adults are also modeling. And sometimes the adults are struggling in how to model that too, occasionally, because they may not have been taught or had enough practice in situations, working through conflict or something like that. So as for that there isn't family engagement, I think the only thing I can think to take away where that may have been that perception is when I think of the little kids, like the only way they can get to the preschool or to the early childhood setting is to be driven by an adult. There isn't a bus that's coming around and picking them up. But if you think of an elementary school, even though pre-K is still pretty small, but I do sometimes see some kindergartners, they're walking to school on their own. The parent, a caregiver might be standing, at the corner, making sure to see their backpack fully go in, but there's kids on scooters, they're riding their bikes, they're jumping on the bus, and they're going to school and they're coming home. So that doesn't mean that families aren't engaged. They just may not be physically driving them there and physically pick them up and bring them home. But that also doesn't mean that we have to assume that they're engaged too, because we've got this system. So it's really equally important for the schools to make sure that they're reaching out and coming up with strategies to keep their parents engaged, sharing with them what they're teaching the students, sharing with them what their expectations are, as well as what they could do to help reinforce those behaviors at home too. So that's, yeah, I hope that answers that.
Yeah.
But I want you to know, when I do hear that, I find it kind of, I want to laugh at it because it seems just like, what? And then you're not doing PBIS if that's not involved. So.
Right. And that often with these misperceptions is the case, right? That somebody's acting on a small amount of information and making assumptions. But I recall that wonderful ebook you all have posted. We did the chapter for early childhood that is talking about family engagement at every level and every way, and the critical importance of it. So just thought of that around the family engagement thing. So another big one is around expectations and rules, and that's very important and is often kind of highlighted as what happens at Universal for PBIS, and we use them too. So we have expectations and rules, and we try to guide people to establish those and use them, and we're all about that. But I think you've seen our pyramid. Our foundation is nurturing responsive relationships, and then we have practices around the environment, and that also includes universally teaching all kids social emotional skills. And so do you feel like that the practices are a collection of practices that aren't only or centered mostly on rules and expectations, they're broader? Does that make these two approaches less compatible, or does that make sense to you as a PBI person?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the pyramid model, from what I understand, is incredibly deliberate and explicit in those practices that you're teaching. And obviously the contingencies change when kids are going to other schools, because now we've got to be like passing grades and there's standardized testing eventually that's happening. And so we need to make sure that students are making the skills and are progressing to be able to graduate. So it doesn't mean that those social emotional practices go away, but what it may mean though is that how do we embed that within our existing routines that we have within our classrooms and how we're engaging with our students across campus. So we have expectations and rules. Obviously the goal would be that what is set up in the classroom is consistent and aligned with what's set up school-wide across those non-classroom settings. But what I think is incredibly important is that, and I'm just going to use, we're respectful, for example, we still need to define and model what that means. So there's no doubt that being respectful was taught in the early childhood setting, and was shown and practiced over and over and everything. Well, the same is true, but now the kids are moving more and they're using language more. And so we change how we're engaging in that. So, the part that I talked about earlier, we've got 27,000 schools that are reporting, but not everybody's implementing with fidelity because it takes practice. This is not a curriculum that we're using. We've looked at our data, we saw what our needs are for our school. And we're going to establish these expectations because we want to set up a positive environment, but we are also making sure to prevent issues we've had in the past. And we're going to get really deliberate on teaching and reinforcing what we'd like to see differently in that process. And so then that opens up all kinds of time to dive deeper on what that means, build relationships for folks, and then respond to problems when they truly are problems, which should hopefully be far and few between when we're implementing with fidelity.
Ooh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because the rules aren't about just being alliterative with the mascot. The rules are about specific problems, right? Or expectations and specific problems that you're addressing. And by being systematic and thoughtful in that manner, right? That's when you see a decrease in, for example, office discipline referrals. I mean, it's very intentional and very systematic, and you have the data that shows that it works.
Yeah, it does. But it's important to know that just because it works and a school gets up with fidelity, they need to keep working and keep sustaining that, because it could go, if they stop implementing after the holidays, they're going to have a real problem, by February. And I think that's that piece of like, how are we always being, the data systems practices piece, are we being really truly engaging in that continuous improvement process and meeting the needs of everybody, and responding to what those needs are.
That's great. All right, here's a biggie that I hear. PBIS is a token economy and it's only consequence focused. And for early educators, so if I believe that, I would be resistant, because we don't use tokens, because little kids, oh, a token, I'll put it in my pocket. They don't really understand it represents something. And then the distal reinforcers like earning something or a classroom party really are unlikely to change their behavior, right? So we do something much more proximal, usually positive descriptive feedback, or a happy dance is sufficient. But so address the token economy thing. And do you feel like that's first of all, is that a misperception? There's the token economy and that's all it is? I think I know your answer to that. And then how should we navigate that around early childhood?
Yeah, it's definitely a misperception. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to remember, PBIS is not a program, it's a framework. And so we're not this is not a curriculum where we open up the pretty package and we implement it exactly as prescribed. So where that token economy, may have come from, I mean, obviously the field it's derived from applied behavior analysis and education and psychology and these different areas. And it never said initially that you must set up a token economy system. What it talked about was specific performance feedback, and particularly specific positive performance feedback. And it may have said at one point in some article, such as a token economy that has contingencies for, for the management in the classroom. And it seemed to take a life of its own in that regard. And then it seemed to be where folks would start fining students if they did use a token economy and take the rewards away from them. And it's like none of that was PBIS. The key is that when you're going to teach the skill that you're wanting the students to perform, you're going to model that for them, and you're going to have them practice it and practice it and practice it, and you're going to reinforce them when you see them using it, and continue to reinforce them to use it so that they will realize that this new skill is a much more appropriate skill to use. If a school decided to move that into a place of where students were rewarded with a sticker or a stamp or some type of ticket, that's completely up to them. And that's that piece where that adaptability, that flexibility with implementation, that's completely school specific. And no way, as PBIS ever said, you must establish a token economy system. So just remember that. But they do say we must have specific performance feedback. We must acknowledge the appropriate behaviors, which makes sense. We teach a new skill. We want to encourage people. It could be as simple as praise, but let's make sure we're specific about what we're praising so that we're likely to see that behavior occur again. And does that help clarify?
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. And I guess hearing what you said, if I was the pre-K teacher, I could say, hey, in my classroom, we want to, I guess my goal is to make sure that the early educator feels a part of the school-wide approach, right? And that shouldn't be well, if you don't do the token, you're not on board, right? And I hope that we're going to help early educators be able to articulate that I do want to do school-wide, but I may approach my feedback, my positive feedback or my contingencies differently with children who are very, very young, which only makes sense, right? Because if I had to motivate a kid in a different way who was really struggling, that would all be a part of PBIS, right? If I have to change up the reinforcement system to motivate a child who's struggling well, you would do that.
Lisa, it makes me think this misperception. There's also a misperception out there that PBIS is all about pizza parties or just parties in general, and that there's no consequence base whatsoever, and everything is just positive, and that kids rule the roost, essentially. And that's not accurate either. I mean, first of all, we never said anything about pizza parties. I mean, if people want to do some type of school-wide event, they absolutely can do that. But the key is that event, contingent on something, and are we making sure to be inclusive of all kids? Because sometimes the kids that truly need to be there may be struggling the most. And so if we're focusing on this number of tickets, they could be one ticket short and they can't be there, but yet we have no idea by being there and belonging in that process could have so much more impact for positive behavior down the road later. I mean, so this is where that whole focus on token economy, like that's not accurate. And there are corrective actions if students do misbehave. We are going to correct them on that. There may be a consequence depending on the severity of the behavior, but no matter what, there's going to be a response. And we need to make sure, again, we're constantly in this teaching mode overall.
Yeah, great. All right, this is the last one. You've been such a good sport with these misperceptions.
Now I'm scared of the last one.
No, I hope you don't feel like you're on the hot seat. So I think one of the important concepts is that schools are encouraged to really think through what are their interventions, and they've created menus, like here's what we might do for tier 2 that's evidence-based, because we want to stay in the evidence-based realm and we don't want people winging it. And here's our approach that we're going to use if kids need tier 3 or intensive intervention. Will that get in the way of, like, if then we decided we're going to get our classroom serving 3 to 5 year olds on board? Because if you have an early childhood special ed classroom, you're going to have 3-year-olds. Would there be flexibility, do you think? If I'm the pre-K teacher, could I come to the tier 2 team and say, yeah, no, check in, check out's not quite. I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. I mean, the key thing that the original, when George Sagai and Rob Horner first founded our center and began the writing about this concept of PBIS before it truly became an official science. They always said there's flexibility in that implementation, because every setting is a little bit different, and there's no prepackaged curriculum. There's no one size fits all whatsoever, but there are going to be some key features that we need to have. We do need to use data to make decisions. We need to make sure that data are meaningful. We do need to have evidence-based practices that we're going to use to make difference, but what those evidence-based practices are going to vary across settings, because the needs are different, the ages of the students are different, and then the systems that we need to set up to be able to support the adults to implement those practices are going to vary, especially across the context. So you've got an early childhood teacher saying, hey, I need some more targeted support for my student. Why can't they go to that team and ask them, like, what are they doing? And some of the practices they may come up with may not fit for that age level, but it certainly doesn't mean that they can't come up with a method on what could assist that teacher for more supports. And this is where I think the teams need to lean into each other and the folks to say, hey, we're here together, we're all of our kids together, and we've got to be able to best support each other. So, I think for the early childhood teachers, leaning into those leadership team meetings to say, hey, I'd like to be a part of this. Some of the data may not be relevant for them because they're not collecting office discipline referrals, hopefully not on the early childhood kids. However, there are different types of data that the early childhood, educators are collecting that they can contribute to that data set, because they're not just looking for things that are going poorly and then reporting on the poor stuff. Like, there's lots of great things that are happening out there, and we need to get the word out and tell people this is what's happening and this is why we think it's happening. Let's keep that going. But I also think the school team could learn from the early childhood teachers too of what's going on, because just because they leave that early childhood setting and start kindergarten doesn't mean like things magic, things don't magically change the minute they walk through that kindergarten door. And so I think it's really important for them to all, because they're all learning from each other. And if we're talking about core features of the data systems practices like you guys are founded in, that's what we're founded in. You have expectations and rules, we do too. They're showing them what that looks like and practicing and modeling it. That's what we're doing too. I don't see that it's different, except maybe the kids get a little bigger. And we've just got to be mindful of that.
Yeah. I love that you pointed out that, it's a framework and we adapt and we learn, right? You've been around for 30 years. PBIS.
I have too.
A ton. Yeah, I know. We've learned a ton, and it changes. The same thing for the pyramid. We learn and we change, and we use science, right, in that way. All right, we're going to move on, but I want to prompt people that you have a chance to pose questions. I saw one that we can squeeze in at the end, but I would love for you to also pose some questions while we share a little bit about what we think you can do to begin this work, to begin the alignment work. So Heather, you want to get us started?
Yeah, so talking about aligning PBIS and the pyramid model, we're starting with that leadership team, and who is that leadership team? And again, going back to that implementation cascade, where whether you are the classroom teacher and you might be the team with maybe an assistant and you've got very few people, but thinking about what am I setting up within my classroom? If you're at the school setting, thinking of who are the folks on that leadership team, and that we need to get engaged in these kind of overall executive functions that involve the partner engagement. Partners are not only our students, but there are fellow teachers, there are fellow staff members on campus, there are family members and caregivers, as well as our administrator. And then, of course, it's our businesses and our agencies, after school programs, that type of thing. Funding and alignment, again, thinking about these are the same kids that are getting bigger, how can we align that to make sure that we are truly supporting, this birth through to grade 12 or, age 2 or 3 to grade 12, and aligning that, coming up with consistent policies, that are supportive of our proactive practices, and supporting our students and supporting our families, and building our workforce so that they can actually be able to provide the supports in these settings so that they're successful in working with all students. The bottom portion of that then deals, it's okay. The bottom portion of that then works specifically on the implementation functions, and Lisa will be talking to you guys in a minute. So next steps for thinking of for state and district leaders. So for that leadership team, I want you to think about, how can you get aligned to having overall, and what's the word, promoting an aligned initiative, whether it's MTSS that's big within your state or your district, pushing that social emotional behavior promotion and intervention. Some districts or states might be using the terminology of school climate, but who are those folks? What are these common priorities that folks are working around? Because we shouldn't be working in silos. And there's some states that have done some great stuff, say, climate's really important to them. They care about, obviously, kids, early childhood through grade 12, but they've got 2 separate teams for dealing with that. And they're both talking about climate. Well, let's come together on this. So that partner engagement piece, sharing implementation and outcome illustrations. I think everybody can learn from each other. We're not an expert in everything. Establishing a work group to begin that alignment, and then doing some type of pitch to district leaders on outcomes gained from the alignment. Or if districts have done a really good job aligning this, maybe those districts can serve as pitching presentations to states so that they can learn from their own folks. Funding and alignment, identifying the various initiatives. Like I said, there's lots of things that are happening in the early childhood field in states, and they may have different funding things. Chances are they may have that within their special ed or general ed as well. And how can we bring those two better working together? So braiding that funding for public preschool, any Part B supports of the IDA and mental health, and identifying existing resources that can contribute. And those additional resources include whether it's personnel, activities that the district or state's engaging in, how can we make sure that we're working together on this, blending funding. I've seen some districts in particular have blended some of their funding to, provide the same type of training or the same coaching thing. They're opening it up to everybody. And that just seems like a really, really smart thing to do.
Great. So if you get a group working on this, I think then it's thinking about what are the policies that can get aligned. And so how you could support and grow the work. And so looking at policies. And then, of course, there's going to be a workforce capacity kinds of steps that you need to take on. What are the professional development opportunities out there from various places? And maybe you could look at shared perspectives. You could think about piloting this work with some eager districts that have those pre-K classrooms and high fidelity PBIS. So think about a pilot. That's a good way to get some attention and more political investment and more funding investment. I think probably the workforce, you'll need to develop a training and technical assistance plan to get to implementation. The implementation blueprint will be really helpful there. Resources on PMI would be really helpful to really think about how do we get started. And of course, nothing is done. Remember your implementation science, nothing's done overnight. It's going to take a while. It takes moving through initial implementation to full implementation in sustainability. And then, of course, the training part, right? So if you get there, you're going to think about training. Don't forget, it's not just about practitioners. It's the teams that need to learn how to team together, the district teams, the school leadership teams. Coaching is a concept in both in PBIS and in pyramid model, and it's coaching for systems as well as coaching for practices. And then, of course, the critical importance of using data decision-making tools for implementation and outcome. And I think there could be a lot of alignment. They're very similar tools in which can be used to both do evaluation as well as to use dynamically in making decisions as you take on this work. So those are our ideas about how you could get started. Hopefully, if we have some conversation with you all and with your questions, you may have other ideas as well to share. All right. So Heather, you might want to take this on. Someone's asking, what is it if you have a district or a school that's implementing both pyramid and PBIS in practical ways, what does it look like to have them both in a single setting in a way that makes it seem less like two different systems? Are they common critical elements? I think we've talked about that, but do you want to add any more?
I mean, if you've got, and I'll just take the elementary school. You've got the elementary school and you have a preschool setting within that same building per se. I think one obvious way is you've got an overall school-wide expectations of what they are. And so ideally that would be the same expectations, and the preschool teachers were also on board with that. Now for PBIS folks, they may say, well, that matrix though, or pyramid model folks may say that matrix doesn't fit. It's not the same language of my kids. You're absolutely right. You need to make sure that it's adapted to fit your developmental age group. So if they develop this expectations by setting matrix and they're saying, okay, in the cafeteria, and they're using, big words that the little kids aren't using, I think the preschool should definitely use those same. They need to bring it down to how they're teaching them and what's at their age level for that. But yet they're all using the same expectations overall. Like we want everybody respectful, but how we teach them and the words we use for that are going to look different.
Yeah. She's also, this respondent, they are also asking, could we extend the practices in pyramid up into K or 1 or 2? And I think the relationship practices, of course, extend up, as well as I think people have, because we're really specific with some examples of practices of how you teach self-regulation or problem solving to young children, young learners, or emotional literacy. But the practices that we stress that you might use also appear in common social emotional curricula, such as Second Step or PAS, which are both popular, popular social emotional curricula that are being used. So I think those push up. There's no reason that those couldn't be pushed up if they resonate with teachers, right? And that actually, if we started to do more blended professional development, like how do you teach kids self-regulation? It might use some of the same kinds of strategies that we're using in pre-K, in K1, 2.
Yeah, and when you think about building well-being around kids, I mean, I think of even some of the high schools that are coming back from a recovery of some type of a traumatic event. One of the things, for example, that they may have in classrooms is Play-Doh. And here they are, they're big kids, 6'5", and they're sitting at a table and they will get up and start to play with the Play-Doh. And that yet Play-Doh is a common thing that you may see in an early childhood classroom. It doesn't mean it's there necessarily therapeutic, but it fits developmentally. But there's that to me feels like an intervention that goes across the ages in there. And so it's not like, well, that's something we do only with little kids. So it's being responsive to the needs of that environment and I think not being so rigid that, oh, what we did with pyramid, we can't do with others. So hopefully our discussion that Lisa and I shared with you is you're going to see these are all the same critical elements. We were invested in all the same critical practices, evidence-based practices, but the method and how they may be taught obviously vary as kids get older and change a little.
So the next question is kind of more of a statement, but I want us to reflect on it because it makes me kind of sad. It's like a person is saying our teachers aren't licensed. So there's a disconnect in the elementary buildings because of that. My response would be, when we think about a school-wide approach or a system-wide approach, we mean everybody. Heather, you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think the issue is that any adult that comes into the building, regardless of what level they're teaching at that building, there's expectations that we need to create a safe environment for everybody that walks in, and there's ways to do that. So just it's that motto, like just because you birthed a child doesn't mean you know how to raise that child type of thing. And so just because they're a parent showing up for their kid doesn't mean that they may know what's expected of being, respectful or responsible on campus. And so we need to continually to embrace people and show them. And I don't think being licensed assumes that people know that. I think we always need to be mindful of supporting overall school-wide environment so that everybody's included, because everybody's going to have a different background that they're bringing, but what is going to be the culture and climate of that school? And that's something that leadership team develops, and the early childhood educator need to definitely be involved with that. Because they are part of that school. They're not just renting out space at one part of the building. They are part of that school. Their kids are going to be staying at that school and growing up at that school. And we want investment with those families and the folks there to know that this is their community school and we're going to be working together.
Yeah, and everyone has something to contribute, right? People have knowledge in different ways. So being licensed doesn't mean all of a sudden you have a different level of contribution. So I would hope that a school team would recognize everyone's contribution. I remember work that PBIS did because I knew one of the bus transportation systems person, and she was doing work on school buses and training the bus drivers, right? So everybody has a part of this. Everyone has a piece of this. Do you remember that? It was like a big thing in Pinellas County, I think.
Yes, I think I was part of that, and it was a very big deal. And we were training bus drivers on how to respond to kids who got on the bus the appropriate way that they were taught at school. And when they sat facing forward and kept their hands to themselves and weren't throwing things out the window. Yeah. And it was amazing how much things changed by having the bus drivers involved. I mean, it's a major responsibility because driving the bus with all those lives sitting behind you. But that little bit of interaction and the relationship being developed from the bus driver with the kids and the kids understanding this is an extension of the school day because they would practice how they're supposed to behave during the school day, pull the bus up. It was really eye-opening. And again, that was a pretty simple intervention. It didn't solve everything, obviously, but it prevented an awful lot of problems in the future.
Oh, it was such a great illustration that everybody at school is a part of this and matters, right, in the implementation. And then someone's asking to speak about community-wide and how it might support this alignment. I think Marissa kind of nailed it, that if the community-wide implementation in the pyramid model kind of happens because we're distributed across the community, but we're not the only ones distributed across the community. Schools have school partners and they have after-school vendors. And, I think that this whole notion of a community-wide effort around social emotional behavior and ensuring that kids who need really more intensive supports is so incredibly promising. Schools struggle with that as well as in early childhood programs, is how do we align all of the resources that are out there in the community around this? It'd be so cool to see it be PBIS Pyramid and all those other players. You and I've talked about it a little bit, but not very much. You have any thoughts about that, Heather?
I don't. I probably do, but I'm sorry. I was putting a link in the chat box and completely spaced out.
No way. That's good. That's great. It's fine. So I don't think we have anything other questions. Thank you all for coming and participating. And there are resources. So where you registered, we keep our webinars up. They're on a page. You can send others to come and watch it. It'll be posted in a couple of days. But there are also all these resources that we hope you'll explore. And we hope that you'll get engaged in this work and let us know how it's going. So thank you so much.
So thank you so very much to both of our panelists for your wonderful insights. Your feedback is very important to the work that we do. Please remember to provide your feedback on this webinar with our post-webinar survey by typing the web address shown on this slide into your internet browser. Your certificate of attendance will appear once you submit the survey. We invite you to visit our website, challengingbehavior.org, to sign up for our upcoming webinars, access recordings, download pyramid model resources, and more. Thank you to our funder for making this webinar possible. This concludes our webinar. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.